Greetings, I'm Bob McChesney. I'll talk first, John will go second. And we're going to talk primarily about the book Dollarocracy rather than Digital Disconnect, which I wrote alone. This is our joint effort that just came out. And a few words about Dollarocracy. The title hopefully is self-evident. Democracy means the rule of the people from ancient Greek, or as Aristotle put it, the rule of the poor, since the poor were the majority of the people. Dollarocracy means the rule of dollars. Those with the most money have all the power. Those without any money have no power. $1, one vote, rather than one person, one vote. This seems like a provocative thesis, I hope. It also, I think, is increasingly recognized as a fairly accurate way to understand how power works in the United States today, how our political system works. In fact, just last year in 2012, two major studies were released by Princeton University Press by leading political scientists, Marty Gillens and a team of scholars based out of Berkeley, and they both reached pretty much the same conclusion, that if you look at the decisions made by the government of the United States in Washington, D.C., the opinions, concerns, values, attitudes of the bottom 95% of the population have absolutely no effect on them whatsoever. The decisions are made entirely to suit the interests of dominant commercial and corporate interests that really control the board in Washington, D.C. Now, 2 months ago, we had our book release party in Washington, D.C., and we were very privileged to be introduced at the party by Senator Bernie Sanders, who wrote the foreword to our book, Dollarocracy. And Senator Sanders said in the introduction, he unequivocally said, I can tell you, and he's been in the Senate now 7 years, and before that he served 16 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. Senator Sanders said, I can say unequivocally that nothing can get through Congress that is opposed by Wall Street or corporate America. Nothing can get through Congress. Another example of what we mean by Dollarocracy, or indication of it, came this past summer. Former President Jimmy Carter, down at the Carter Center in Atlanta, met with some visiting German dignitaries for an off-the-record discussion of world politics. And as it happened, someone brought their iPhone, so it suddenly went on the record. And President Carter said something quite striking. He said to the Germans, the United States is no longer a functional democracy. We are off the grid. We're not what we once were. We're not what countries are in Europe or East Asia. We're no longer a functional democracy. Now, Dollarocracy, this system we have today, has very severe consequences for us. It's not just an abstract issue. It's not a debating issue. It's not a parlor game. It means that those at the top rig the system to suit their interests with very little concern for those beneath them. So what we see under the era of Dollarocracy, which we can date roughly 3 or 4 decades, increasing poverty. One of the striking statistics that came out just this year is that nearly half the American population is now considered either in poverty or low income. We've basically lost almost all the gains we made against poverty in this country from the 1920s to the 1970s have been lost since then. We're back to the 1920s in terms of poverty in the United States. In terms of economic inequality, between 1945 and 1973, virtually all the increases in productivity that were made in the American economy were shared with workers. Workers' incomes went up as their productivity went up. Since the early to mid-1970s, there have been massive increases in productivity, but virtually none of that has gone to workers in terms of their real income. It's all gone to the top. And what's resulted is that most of the income gains of the last 30 years have gone to the top 1, 2, 3%, and a stunning amount of it's gone just to the top 1/10 of 1%. So we have record levels of economic inequality in this country, things we haven't seen here since the Gilded Age, and this gap between rich and poor. One marketing person from Procter & Gamble last year said, we have to rethink how we sell products in America today. Because today in America, you have levels of economic inequality you associate with countries like Malaysia or the Philippines. We no longer have the rates we would associate with countries in Europe or East Asia. This is what we mean by Dollarocracy. You also get with Dollarocracy extraordinary corruption. Of course, that's a given. If money owns the board, they're going to buy their decisions. We get that. But it also means more than that. It means that the range of legitimate debate is bounded by what suits the interests of those with lots of money. And what that means realistically for the economy of the United States is that what we're in the midst of now, the 5th or 6th year of the Second Great Depression or the Great Stagnation, pick your term, the Great Recession, there's no end in sight. Neither party is discussing anything that will do anything to raise wages in any appreciable manner, to address inequality in any appreciable manner, to have economic growth in any appreciable manner. What we have been tasting for the last 5 years is basically, given the range of debate continents in Washington, D.C., all we have hope for off into the future as far as the eye can see. That's dollarocracy. It's their system. This is the system they want. It's not everyone else's system. Now, in the book, what John and I do is talk about how the election system has been neutered, how dollarocracy has taken dead aim at it and tried to reduce as much as possible the ability of elections to counter the power of money, the ability of elections to let people come into the system and direct it in different ways, ways that might be more appropriate for the people of the country. You might get the sense already that people get depressed by our talk. I don't know. Am I picking up on that? Yeah. Well, you haven't seen anything yet. But I want to tell you that it's not all bad news, first of all. But secondly, the bad news comes because the way to understand the era of dollarocracy and what's going on with the elections is to understand that it's not been a continual succession of defeats for popular forces or democracy in American history. Quite the contrary. Between 1900 and 1970, America made a number of dramatically positive and progressive advances. This became a much better, a much more democratic, and a much more humane country. We got the right to have trade unions, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare. We had public education for working class people vastly better than almost anywhere in the world by the middle of the 20th century. We had a higher percentage of our people going to universities and colleges than anywhere else in the world by the middle of the 20th century. And most importantly, between 1900 and 1970, we saw the expansion of the franchise from a country that only white men could vote to women and African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans, and finally, 18 to 20-year-olds could vote by the early 1970s. We finally became a full-fledged democracy in terms of everyone being able to participate by the early 1970s. Now, in 1970, I was a teenager. I was 17, and there was a survey that was done of all the teenagers of the world. And the American teenagers in 1970 were ranked among the 3 most optimistic groups of teenagers in the world. The other 2 were Israeli and Chilean. Chilean fell off the list soon thereafter. But I remember the optimism that I felt then and that I felt my peers felt. There was a sense that, yeah, we had the war in Vietnam, yeah, we had militarism, yeah, we had racism, but we'd come off lots of advances, and we had the wind of history behind it. More were in front of us. We were going to be victorious. We were unstoppable to make this a more democratic and humane country. At the same time that I was optimistic, and most of my friends were, there were some people in America who were very pessimistic at that time. And these people tended to be big business, corporate bosses, wealthy people who didn't like the way the country had been moving and didn't want to see it continue in that direction. In the mid-1970s, a group that was sponsored by some of these wealthy financiers and people who were concerned about this was published, and it said that America today, by the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, was suffering from what they called a crisis of democracy. And the crisis of democracy was that there was too much democracy. You had African Americans, women, young students, young workers, and we had a very militant labor movement in the early 1970s who were making demands upon the system. And the system didn't work well when all these people tried to get involved in it. Their version of democracy worked best when those people went back to the couch, were apathetic, were cynical, tuned out, and let the traditional rulers of society make all the decisions, business. And that was the goal for this community. In our book, what John and I write about at length is probably, in fact, I think unquestionably, the single most important document in this period that sort of outlined the game plan for corporate America. And this is a document that was commissioned by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is not part of the government, but rather a trade association of large business. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce commissioned one of the leading corporate attorneys of America in 1971 to write a short memo that would be distributed confidentially to 50 or 60 of the leading corporate CEOs and billionaires in the country to talk about the crisis of democracy and what to do about it in America. They were deeply alarmed that Ralph Nader was the most revered person in America at that time across the political spectrum. They were very concerned that business was the low ebb of prestige, even among middle class and upper middle class young people who were normally the backbone of business support. We're beginning to question whether we even need large corporations, whether that's a rational way to organize an economy. They were also fiercely upset about the fact that there was a sense among people that government could be used progressively to solve problems, that government could be the solution to problems. All of these things riled the business community, so they turned to this corporate lawyer, a gentleman who made tens of millions of dollars primarily representing the tobacco industry, named Powell. And he wrote the the document for them. You can find it online. Just go to Google, Lewis Powell 1971 memo. It's one of the great documents of American history, great in terms of impact, not necessarily content, because as much as any document, it really outlines what happens and what would happen in the coming generation of American politics. Powell argued that what was absolutely necessary was for big business to take over the government. The era of this too much democracy had to go. Business had to resume control. The way it would do that was it had to increase its spending on politics dramatically. Campaigns, lobbying, whatever it took to basically make it so no matter which party won the election, business was always in power. There was no doubt that who controlled everything. In the 20 years after the Powell memo was written and distributed confidentially, corporate spending on lobbying in Washington, D.C. increased 10 times, tenfold increase, 1,000%. To put this in some sort of context, K Street as a term, by 1990 came to represent an industry, corporate lobbying, like Wall Street or Madison Avenue represents an industry. That term didn't exist in 1970. In 1970, Washington, D.C. was a sleepy town. It did not have any great wealth in it because it was just a government town. But today, if you were to look at the wealthiest counties in America, I believe 4 of the 10 wealthiest are the suburban ring around Washington, D.C. And it's all that money that came in and created those spectacular amounts of wealth for people to get their mitts into the government and to control it. Powell in his memo said that we need to take over universities and make them more sympathetic to business. We have to take over the media and make it much more sympathetic to business, much more hostile to labor, much more hostile to people who weren't sufficiently pro-business. We had to cultivate the idea that government could only do bad things and should never be turned to. It was an evil force. And we also have to make sure that we do something about the court system. Powell said we got a real problem with our court system in America. Even presidents that we think are on our side, like Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, when they get in power, appoint people who go rogue on us. People like Earl Warren or Harry Blackmun. They get this lifetime appointment, then they say, hey, I'm in here, I'm gonna do some good for the country. I'm gonna take this Constitution stuff seriously. Powell said these guys have gotta go. We've got to make sure when we get one of our guys in the court, he understands what side of the bread the butter's on. He always makes sure business is taken care of first and foremost. That's the job of the Supreme Court justice. And following Powell's memo, an organization was started called the Federalist Society, whose job was basically to train future jurors and future justices to be pro-business all the way, so there'd be no margin of error, no chance of them going rogue. Coincidentally, 2 months after Powell's memo was written, it was the hot item of the corporate community in America, there was an opening on the U.S. Supreme Court. And guess who Richard Nixon appointed? Lewis Powell. Now, when Lewis Powell went up to be considered, the existence of this memo wasn't known. And Powell managed to get it approved 99-1. He sailed through. It was a coronation. He was considered a moderate Southerner because he was from Virginia, and sort of an ideal person. Now, a moderate Southerner in those days meant basically, you haven't even heard the joke. It means a white guy who wasn't a member of the Klan. That's a joke. And so he sailed through. And what's interesting is as soon as Lewis Powell got on the court, his #1 obsession became one thing. He wanted to take off any limits on billionaires and businesses from being able to spend as much as they wanted on campaigns. That was his #1 career-defining issue. He wanted business and billionaires, rich people, to spend as much as they wanted on political campaigns. He wanted any restriction on that considered unconstitutional. Now, he wasn't able to win that fight for a number of reasons we go into in the book. William Rehnquist opposed him, ironically enough, the conservative Chief Justice, opposed him adamantly on those issues, emphatically. But he finally left the court, and Rehnquist left the court, and in 2005, John Roberts became Chief Justice, and he was right out of the Lewis Powell playbook, the Federalist Society Hall of Fame. He was someone who'd written a decision Lewis Powell would have loved probably before he even got to the court. He knew he was going to write it. It was so important to him. He was just waiting for the case to come along so he could get the facts he needed to unleash money. And he got that case in the Citizens United case, which finally came down in January 2010. We go into the details of the case in the book. It's even more cynical and shameless than you might imagine, the way that decision came down, the sort of absurdity of the decision. As a result of Citizens United, basically it meant that it affected really only like 1/100th of 1% of Americans. People who want to give $10 or $20 million a year to elections, that's who it unleashed, those individuals. It also unleashed corporations to give as much money as they wanted to campaigns. And to be fair, as this defenders point out, it also unleashed labor unions to give as much money as they wanted to campaigns. Now, some of the younger people in the room, ask some of the old timers what a labor union is. It's something we used to have in America. And now, in fairness also, Citizens United said that it couldn't go directly to the campaign. It had to go to a third-party group that wasn't formally connected to the campaign. But yeah, you can hardly say that sentence without laughing. It was known to be a joke then. It became a joke. And these so-called third-party groups, ironically, became experts at what's called dark money. And they almost became synonymous with the term dark money because the money that was given to them, rather than being transparent and everyone would know who gave it, went through a labyrinth of Cayman Island-style money laundering, so that for many races it's almost impossible to know who gave this money. And in many cases, you do find out who finally gave it because of filings that have to be done with the government. It's many months after the election, so it has no effect on the actual election itself, which isn't much of a price to pay. In short, we unleashed money as never before. Now, I don't mean to say that before Citizens United things were hunky-dory. What it did, though, is accelerate a process that had been going on for 30 or 40 years. As Larry Lessig put it put a bullet in the body, but the body was already cold. In 2012, and there's no records that are kept of actual spending in the United States. John and I had to put this together ourselves using the best data we could. In 2012, by our count, almost $11 billion was spent on the election in the United States, almost $11 billion. That's about twice of what was spent in 2008. So we just about doubled the amount spending on the election, on all state, local, and national. That's about 10 times what was spent 20 years ago, even allowing for inflation. So we've seen this exponential increase in spending on campaigns. Now let's put that in context. Most people say, oh, that's just America. That's how we roll in America. That's how democracies roll, because after all, we're a democracy. Germany just had national elections about 2 months ago. You might have seen coverage of it right below, the Britney Spears bud implant story. Got a little bit of coverage in the media. And Germany had these national elections, and they actually have to announce how much is spent on elections right away, so you can actually see. And we figured out, John and I did the numbers on this, for every dollar German politicians and parties spent on their national elections this year, 2013, in the United States in the 2012 congressional and presidential elections, we spent $34. 34 to 1. Now that Germany must be really have crappy elections if they hardly spend any money on them, right? They must really be the worst elections in the world. We're all spending them 34 to 1. We must be kicking their butt. And think about it. Let's say we outspent Germany 34 to 1 on early childhood education. Let's say for every dollar Germany spends educating a first grader, we spent $34 in the whole country. What would an American first grade classroom look like? You'd have one teacher, 4 students, 4 assistant teachers, a music teacher, an art teacher, a gym teacher, a personal trainer, a chef, a masseuse. It'd be unbelievable. We would have the most incredible education system in the world if we outspent Germany 34 to 1. But what happens when you outspend Germany 34 to 1 in elections? What do you get then? Well, what you learn is that more money spent equals more bogus elections. More money is bad, not good, when it comes to elections. In fact, it's very bad, and it's very bad for a couple of clear reasons. First of all, the Citizens United case revoked and rejected what is understood in every other democracy and what had been understood in this country throughout our history and have been voted on by our people over and over again in legislatures throughout our history, which is there's a difference between someone giving $20 or $50 or even $1,000 to a candidate and someone dropping $50 million on an election. The former is civic. When you give $25 to a candidate, you're not expecting to get a government contract out of it. You're not expecting to get a tax loophole put into the books for you. You're basically, for whatever reason, this is what candidate you think is good. It's a civic virtue. The Supreme Court says that's the same as someone dropping $50 million. Well, we know that's not true. When people start dropping serious money on elections, they want to buy results. It's part of their business model. It's something they need to do to make more money. The government, the governing process, is something you have to factor into your business expenses. And here's really no better example of this than probably the most reviled people in this room, I'm willing to wager a bet, the Koch brothers. Now everyone here, I said there might be some lovers of the Koch brothers here, but the Koch brothers are actually very interesting people. They're very interesting for this reason. If I were to say to you, name name 2 people, that gives it away. Name a rich person, that makes it easier, who gives the most money to liberal causes in America. Causes, not candidates. Who is it? I doubt anyone would say the Koch brothers, but it might be the Koch brothers. They've opposed every war America's been in for the last 25 years and supported anti-war work. They've given money to the ACLU to oppose the Patriot Act, and they've opposed surveillance. They're very much opposed to surveillance. They're in favor of same-sex marriage. They spent money on that. They're in favor of legalizing marijuana. They spent money on that. They've paid for research to deal with the racist implications of the prison industrial complex. The Koch brothers, all those things, all those causes, they've forked out serious coin to show that that's important to them. But a funny thing happens when you look at who they give money to for candidates. None of those issues, none of those issues has any influence on who they give money to for candidates. And they dropped $300 million last year in candidates. None of those issues have any influence. When you look at who they support for issues for candidates, what candidates they support, there are 6 issues they care about. They want someone who's not going to tax them. They want someone who hates labor unions and will crush them. They want someone who will not regulate business or allow business to be regulated. They want to get rid of public education. They hate Social Security and they hate Medicare. That's their 6-pack. And everyone they support gets an A+ on those 6 issues, and they flunk the others, but they don't care, because this is what they care about. So they were big contributors to the Ken Cuccinelli campaign in Virginia. Ken Cuccinelli is terrible on all their causes. Horrible, the worst guy in the world. But he's A+ on what matters to them. They're worth $50 billion, they want to be worth $100 billion. That's why they invest in politics, to get candidates who are going to serve them. That's how it is for Shelley Adelson, too. He says he's for socialized medicine. Shelley Adelson says, I'm a liberal. But that's not why I give money. I give money to get rich. That's why you do it. That's why these guys do that. So more money is more bogus. And then where does the money go? That's the other question. And the majority of the money goes to political advertising on television. And that is a punchline too, because that, or a tragic one. Yeah, no, it's hard to laugh at it. This last election, roughly $5 to $6 billion went to pay for television ads, net campaign political ads. And what we've seen in America is it's created this enormous corporate lobbying force that stands to oppose any reform of our system to take money out of politics to reduce the effectiveness of these ads. And that's the corporate commercial lobby that represents TV stations. And about a half dozen companies own most our TV stations, local stations. The average local TV station in 1992 got 2 or 3% of its revenues from candidate ads. By this last election, depending on the market you're in, it was 15 to 20% at the low end, 40% at the high end of all revenues come from TV candidate ads or political advertising. This is what's made this an extremely lucrative industry. It's taken an industry in decline and given it a rejuvenation and new life. And they oppose any sort of reform, much like the NRA opposes any form of gun control. Now, the other part of these ads that's come in is that over the time they've become increasingly negative. And virtually all of the so-called third-party ads are negative ads. They're attack ads trying to convince you that someone is horrible and awful. And the quality of these ads is beneath comment. As a rule, they're appalling. Even for the people you like, they're appalling. It's just, you feel dirty after you watch a bunch of them. You want to go take a shower. You feel like you've been in a toxic cesspool. To put this in context, most Americans say, well, that's the American way. That's how we hang in America. We got to spend money so we can speak. That's how it works in the free world. Well, no, that's not how it works in the free world. We didn't have those things 40 years ago. We hardly had any negative ads into the 70s. We didn't have any at all before the 60s. It was a very small part of we actually had elections before 1964. We managed to sort of do it. And if you go to other countries, Germany, a 72% voter turnout, no TV ads, illegal. Sweden, 80% voter turnout, no TV ads, illegal. Norway, 79% voter turnout this year, no TV ads for candidates, illegal. Britain, illegal, they're not allowed to do. In other countries, in other democracies, TV candidate ads are to campaigns what germ warfare is to warfare. They should be outlawed by the Geneva Convention. They're outlawed in these countries because they're seen as pollution, as sewage that get in the way of credible democratic discourse. They just don't allow it. It's just not permitted. The problem with these ads, though, of course, besides having a powerful lobby behind them, is that they do work. And one of the reasons they work is there's so little journalism left in America. This is a main theme both of this book and of Digital Disconnect, the other book that's up in front of you there, that the business model for journalism in America is dead. Advertising as it goes online no longer needs to subsidize content, so we have far fewer working journalists today than we've had in the past. And there's very little coverage of campaigns anymore. Most of the races you vote for in the ballot will get almost no journalistic coverage whatsoever, which amplifies the power of the money dramatically because it's unchallenged at any point. They can set the agenda. And what little journalism there is tends to be obsessed with predictions, polls, and assessing whether the ads are working, allowing the advertising to set the news cycle and what's going to be discussed in the journalism. In short, what we argue in the book and discuss at some length is we have to solve the journalism problem, or we aren't going to solve the democracy and election problem. We aren't going to get out of dollarocracy unless we create the institutions that give us a competitive, independent, quality journalism. It's an existential threat. Now, that's the good news. Oh wait, no, that's not good news. No. People say, well, you're so depressing. I think you got to know the truth to solve a problem. I think you need an accurate diagnosis to really come up with a solution. Hopefully we have given the book an accurate diagnosis. But we are not pessimists. And we're not pessimistic at all for two reasons. First of all, I think it's quite striking today that the Dollarocrats, those with lots of money, are obsessed with two things in the last 5 or 10 years. One, they want to unleash as much money as they can in campaigns, unlimited amounts. And secondly, they're now obsessed with being able to suppress the vote of poor people, people of color, young people, and old people who aren't seen as less likely to vote Republican. So these are the two things they're obsessed with, is suppressing the vote in one hand and unleashing money in the other. Well, there's a reason for that. Think about it. They know they can't win a fair election. They know they don't have the numbers on their side. They know their system is failing. They know that they have to do something to rig the game or their history, their dead meat. That should give us great strength. I didn't feel that way 30 years ago. Now I know I've got the numbers on my side. I like those odds. They understand it too. That's why they're obsessed with suppressing votes and obsessed with unleashing money. If they thought they could win a fair election, they wouldn't worry about that crap. They didn't worry about that in the 80s. They didn't have to suppress votes and rig elections to win elections in 1984. They could win them. And there's one other reason. I think that at times, human nature makes us really difficult to see things historically. We tend to look at what we're experiencing now and what I've described, which is very powerful and ominous and grim, and you look at the day before and say, hey, it was just like this pretty much yesterday. And you naturally say, well, it's probably going to be like this tomorrow. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be. It didn't change from today to yesterday, so why should it change to tomorrow? And we get this belief that nothing can ever change. Of course, it's completely irrational. No social change in history would have ever happened if that's actually how the world worked, if that belief set worked, that we can always predict the future, nothing will change. That was brought home to me very powerfully by a professor I had in graduate school. When I finished my PhD and moved from Seattle to Madison 25 years ago, I went in to see a professor to say goodbye. He's a white South African who'd been working on apartheid, anti-apartheid, I should be clear to say, against apartheid his whole life, and knew more about South African politics than anyone I knew. Studied it, researched it, talked about it. And I went in to see him and he was very depressed. And I said, what's up? And he said, well, I've been talking to my friends, my family, everyone in South Africa. We're now convinced the dominant Afrikaans political party will never negotiate with the ANC, will never get rid of apartheid peacefully in South Africa. It's hopeless. I've never felt this way in 30 years. It is now hopeless. And if we do get justice for black Africans, it will come at such an enormous bloodbath, with literally hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people dying, that it'll make the country uninhabitable for a century. That's what he said. He said this in April of 1988. 2 years later, Nelson Mandela was released from Robben Island prison. 5 years later, he was elected president of South Africa. There was less violence in that 5 years than in a New Jersey bar fight on a Saturday night. So my friend, who knew more about South Africa than anyone I knew, completely whiffed, completely missed it. Now, he accurately saw the tensions in South Africa, but he didn't see a way out of it. He just assumed the worst would happen because he just assumed that. He had nothing to work on. And that taught me that we shouldn't worry about predicting the future. We can't worry too much about that. What we can do is look at the tensions in the present and then try to understand them, come up with solutions. So when you know what hits the fan, we've got progressive ideas, democratic ideas, humane ideas to offer that can solve problems in the best possible way. That's our job. And that's what we try to do in this book, is equip people to participate at that level. Now, as I told you, I'm an optimist. I will go so far as to say I'm the second most optimistic person in this room. In fact, I'm the second most optimistic person in the state of Oregon tonight. Number one is my beloved co-author, who's the person who knows more about American politics than anyone I know, and is here to talk more about the politics of Dollarocracy and what we can do to vanquish it. John Nichols.
Bob McChesney, worthy of applause. This is quite a podium you have here. Solid. I feel like if Wayne Morse was still around, he would come here and bang on it and tell you what a crisis we have in the Republic. Wayne Morse was not from Oregon. He was from Wisconsin. He was born down in southwestern Dane County, one township over from where Robert M. La Follette was born. In our little county in Wisconsin, we breed very radical people who try to go out and make a kind of an uncommon demand on the American experiment, and that is that it would be a democracy where the people were in charge, where the people would be in charge and not powerful elites. And that woman up front had it exactly right. Yes, that is what we're all about. And so I'm so glad you came out tonight. It is wonderful to be in Portland, Oregon, and it is wonderful to be in a state which I believe, if I am correct, now correct me if I am wrong, I believe that you are about to have a referendum sometime relatively soon on the question of labeling genetically modified food. Is that right? Yeah. Is that next year you're talking about it? Is that right? Who said right?
I said yeah.
You said yeah. Is that it's in play, right? It's something.
Yeah.
And you know what? I want to get you set up for that so you're ready. All right? Because you may not be prepared for what you're about to go through, but you need to understand that in any state that votes on labeling genetically modified food, you are about to experience full-on dollarocracy. And dollarocracy can be explained in the esoteric or in the theoretical, or you can just go straight in and live it. The state of Washington just lived it. And the state of California lived it last year. Here's how dollarocracy works. About a month ago, up in Washington State, and I know Oregonians are better, but Washington's it's a relatively sophisticated state. They're generally, they walk among us, and we can hardly tell them from, and so, I think we can accept that they're decent people. My friend Mr. Jaffe, he taught over across the river there, and said we came here. Yes, it was a brighter, better bunch, but still. So, Washington, a month ago, they did a poll. They did polls in Washington, and it showed that pretty much, there could be a stray one here or there, but basically everyone in Washington was in favor of labeling genetically modified food. Now, it didn't mean that everybody was against genetic engineering or genetic modification. There were many people who said there could be some places where it would be useful. I think that once upon a time, Jefferson was grafting things his slaves were doing it, but, that somebody on the plantation was grafting, and so we understand that, and George Washington Carver did something with peanuts, and so, it's not pure opposition to genetic modification, but everybody thought that it would be a good thing to know if they had, merged your tomato with a fish. And so it was very, very popular, overwhelmingly popular. That was a month ago. And upon receiving this information and learning that one state in the U.S. might start to label genetically modified food products, the largest grocery manufacturers in America decided to do something about it. Now, in most countries in the world, in many, many countries around the world label GM foods, their ability to do something about it would be to maybe put their executive on TV or maybe even, engage in debates and dialogue. They didn't do that. Companies not located in the state of Washington began to pony up at a rate of $4 million apiece to build a campaigning fund of $23 million. That's what's reported so far. It will probably go when all the reporting comes out, closer to $30 million. This huge amount of money, which they poured into the state, and in a period of less than a month, caused people who thought, yes, I would like to know what happens to my food, how my food is produced. I'd like to have basic information. Again, I am not some, terrified person. I'm not opposed to everything, but I want basic information. I'm a mom. I'm going to the frozen foods section. I'd like to know what I'm getting the kid. They voted against labeling their food. Overwhelmingly voted against. $23 million came in, slathered the debate in what I can say, and I'm going to say this in the most scientific way I can. We're outright lies, and I mean, literally, they're saying, it's like they're going to graft your tomatoes to your bread. It was madness, complete fantasy, and they got people who were smart enough to know without seeing the ads what was the logical response to vote against the logical response. Now you ask yourself, you say to yourself, well, those are, we're Oregonians. We're not as dumb as Washingtonians, so certainly we wouldn't fall for that sort of thing, I'm quite sure. And of course, the Californians fell for it last year, and well, we all know about Californians. But, I know that you think you're smarter, and I respect that. We all think we're smarter until we realize that we didn't pull it off. And this is the important thing to understand. All of those corporations that flooded that money in didn't flood that money in to foster a debate. Didn't flood that money in to make sure that everybody had information or that people understood the whole of the issue. That had nothing to do with it. They flooded that money in because the largest grocery manufacturers in America, our food processors, figured out quite a while ago that you want healthy food. And so they all went in. Yes, they make junk, of course, because there are times, you're on a road trip, you're going to want some junk from the gas station. But, by and large, when we go to we would like something healthy. So they created veggie burgers and things like that. And the biggest money going into the Washington referendum wasn't coming from the junk food industry. It was coming from companies that produce healthy, good food. Like, I live in the garden with my beautiful children veggie burgers, right? And they got a picture of a cute little kid on the front. And you want to have the I live in the garden with my cute little kids in the veggie burger thing there, right? But you see, if you go to the frozen food thing and it's labeled genetically modified, as a mom, you might say, what did you do to my food here? And maybe you would be a little bit cautious, skeptical. Maybe you would ask questions. They didn't give that money to have a debate. They gave that money to make sure that you would never ask those questions. It was not a transformational or intellectual investment. It was a transactional investment. They paid money to get a result that would be good for them from a business standpoint. Because if you got that GM label on the front of frozen food, people just aren't gonna rush to get it. And so you understand what happened just last week in the state just across the river. Huge amounts of money shifted public sentiment against what a month ago everybody thought was a good idea. And what is still a good idea. We should have information about what we eat. Brothers and sisters, that's Dollarocracy. That's how Dollarocracy works. People with enough money don't elect candidates. That's not what this is about. They don't make one party rule over another party. That's not what this is about. They shape the debate itself so that no matter who wins elections, no matter what happens, ultimately, they get a debate so narrow and so defined by their money that they never, ever lose. And that, my friends, has nothing to do with democracy. It has nothing to do with elections. It has nothing to do with voting or anything like that. It has everything to do with owning the process from start to finish so you never lose. And that's what we're supposed to not have in America. Now, this is an interesting thing. We talk a lot about the United States, how it was founded, where we come from, all these good things. And I don't want to disabuse people of any of their romantic notions, but the United States is not a horrible country. It's actually kind of a cool experiment. And 200 some years ago, Tom Paine, who was a totally cool person, right, wrote this great pamphlet, Common Sense, and he said, I got an idea for you. You understand how radical this idea was? He says, let's throw off the king. And if you read Common Sense, it's one of the best, some of the snarkiest writing. It's better than any comment on the bottom of a tweet you've ever seen. It's like that Tom Paine is going in there and he says, you know what happens when royal families intermingle again and again? Kings get dumber, right? They don't improve the gene pool. And so Tom Paine offered the radical notion that maybe if we brought all the people in, if we opened up the process, we might have better ideas and better governance. So why don't we get rid of the king, even though it's divine and all that? Let's get rid of the divine right of kings and put the people in charge. This was an incredibly radical idea. And they went and fought a fabulous little revolution, and they won. Thanks, of course, the French guy helped, Lafayette. It was cool. And then so they win their revolution, and then they kind of have to figure out how to govern the place. And that was where it sort of fell apart. Sort of fell apart because they all got together and they said, we know we are really cool people. We just fought this great revolution. We're just not sure we want everybody. You know, it's like, I know you're okay, but him. So, the idea is maybe we could just sort of limit the franchise just a wee bit. And so at the founding of the American experiment, if we were electing a member of Congress, we'd be in a room like this, a little smaller room. There wouldn't be this many people. And ironically enough, the people there wouldn't look exactly like you folks. They'd look like some of you, but not all of you, because, see, the only people in the room could be white guys. And I have nothing against the white guy. But the white guys would all get in the room, and then, of course, the women, they had to not be in the room because women weren't white guys. And the African Americans, the slaves who did all the work, they couldn't be in the room because they weren't white guys. And the Hispanics, and there were a lot of Hispanics, particularly in some of the southern areas of this country, they couldn't be in the room because they weren't white guys enough. And Native Americans, who actually owned the place, they couldn't be, or did at one time, they couldn't be in the room because they weren't white guys. And then the ironic thing, and this is a little upsetting to some of the white guys, was poor white guys couldn't be in the room because they weren't white guys enough. And so as a result, you had wealthy white guys, plantation owners, business owners, and they all got in that room. And ironically enough, though certainly they were worldly and enlightened people, their concerns tended to stray toward those of white guys. And so they didn't think it was quite so bad to have things like slavery and subjugation of women and the Trail of Tears and the theft of Native American lands and all sorts of really bad stuff. Because, the ironic thing is that when you don't let people vote, when you don't let people be a part of the process, when you don't have an informed electorate engaged fully in the whole of the electoral process, you know what you end up with? A process that reflects those who are in it and those who have the most power. So, but they were not mean white guys. They wanted to, they certainly had some respect for everybody else. So when they had one of those sessions where they chose a member of Congress, they would open the windows up. And so the women and the black people and the Hispanics and the Native Americans and the poor white guys, which was, interestingly enough, about 96% of the population of the country. Not kidding, 96% of the population. They could stand outside and look in and watch their leaders being chosen. And that was what we called democracy at the start of the American experiment. It was a spectator sport. For the last 200 some years, we've been working very hard to make it a participatory sport. But as we have struggled over the last 200 years to make it participatory, where everybody's in, where you don't have to look through the window, where they actually open the doors up and we can go right in, the people who were in there, and again, I'm not against the white guy, but quite a few of them are, in fact, white guys. They have kept trying really hard to keep the door locked, keep the window down, and make sure that it remains a spectator sport. That's the great struggle in America. It's always been a struggle, and it's been fabulous. And the good guys, the good gals, we've been winning a lot for a long time. We fought a civil war. And the great thing about the Civil War, and you don't often hear that phrase, the great thing about the Civil War. The great thing about the Civil War was that when it was going on, people actually understood it pretty well. When Lincoln and all these guys went around and they said, well, this is about saving the Union, keeping the Union together. A surprising number of Northerners said, that's not that big a deal to us. If the South wants to exit, it's okay. It's because we're afraid someday they'll send Ted Cruz to the Senate, and we all know what's going to happen then. And so there was a bit of a, just fighting to save the Union wasn't exactly this deep thing that everybody got. And so finally in 1863, the greatest vice president in American history you've never heard of, Hannibal Hamlin, actually convinced Abraham Lincoln, if we're going to build out a movement to actually win this war, we might have to make it clear to people that this is about ending slavery. And so they did an Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was not merely about saying that African Americans would be freed once the Union forces got into the South. The Emancipation Proclamation was about saying to Union forces, to the people in the North, the reason we're fighting this war is to end the original sin of the American experiment, which is the permission of human bondage. And so people actually got what it was about. And when it ended, what happened immediately? They passed 3 constitutional amendments to open the doors up. They said African American men, just men, could vote. They talk about equal protection under the law. The first African Americans to serve in the United States Congress didn't serve in our Congress starting in the 1960s or the 1970s. First African Americans to win statewide offices didn't win in the 1960s and 1970s. They won in the 1860s and the 1870s. We fought a civil war, and we actually expanded the franchise so significantly that people who had been slaves in one decade became members of Congress in the next decade. That is a liberation movement that has as its core a small d democratic goal and has as its result a transformational moment in our politics. Big deal thing. Now, of course, the great historian Eric Foner always says, best way to understand democracy in America, especially voting rights, is like an accordion. It gets pulled out, and then it gets pushed back in. The music getting pulled out is very beautiful. The music coming back in, it's not always as pretty. And so we expand and contract the franchise, and so we brought Jim Crow in, the Ku Klux Klan. We told those African Americans who were elected to Congress, now you're back to the segregated South. You're out of the game. But an interesting thing happened along the way. When they passed the constitutional amendment to say that African Americans could be full citizens, women said, hold it, we did not know you could do that. We didn't. This is interesting. You can pass an amendment to the Constitution and we get to vote? We would like one of those. And so women started fighting in an incredibly brutal and difficult multi-generational struggle to amend the Constitution of the United States to let everybody into that room. And the interesting thing about that struggle is it is so badly taught today that we were at a great college, great university recently, and we were talking about amending the Constitution, making radical reforms in this country. Some guy, young guy gets up, and he's a very nice guy, decent person, I'm sure, raises his hand and says, well, yeah, you're talking about all these big reforms, and you're comparing it to when women got the vote. It's not a compromise. See, everybody wanted women to get the vote. It's not. That was easy. You're talking about big stuff. No, they didn't want women to get the vote. The women died trying to get the vote. They chained themselves to the White House. They struggled. They were force-fed. It was a brutal, awful struggle, but they actually got the vote in 1920. And that's how we teach it, and then we stop. We say, women got the vote in 1920. Isn't that cool? We don't actually make the connection to what it meant when they got the vote. This is a big deal. If women hadn't gotten the vote, Mitt Romney would be the president of the United States today. No, this is real stuff, guys. It's like voting rights, democracy, a functional electoral process matters. It's different when you bring more people in. Mitt Romney does not become the president of the United States. Paul Ryan is not the vice president because of women, not because of men. Well, things were getting wild there in the 1920s. We decided, well, heck, if we're going to give women the vote, then the Native Americans, whose land it was, said we would like the vote too. And it was only in the 1920s that we actually expanded the franchise to Native Americans. Then in the 1940s, they actually started to expand it in some states to Latinos. going crazy. Then, in the 1950s, 1960s, we started to say, okay, we were wrong. Those African Americans that we gave the right to vote back in the 1860s, now we're going to let them vote again, too. We're going to have Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, March on Washington. We're going to open this thing up. Things were really on the march. And you know what? This is one of my most favorites. In 1962, within the lifetime of some people in this room, we passed a constitutional amendment to ban the poll tax. It wasn't until 1962 that we removed the wealth barrier to voting in this country. 1962. And then we finished out that remarkable decade by saying, you know what else? If we're going to let black people and Native Americans and women and all these folks vote, why don't we let 18 to 21-year-olds vote on whether they want to go die in wars in Vietnam? It's an incredible thing. We expanded this franchise out so well, it got so rolling there that it was kind of look like we might actually be a democracy. And of course, as Bob has pointed out, that frightens some people very, very much. The last 40 years have been the darkest period of our expansion of democracy in the history of the Republic. There's never been a period this long where it's been under assault. We've always had fits and starts. But the fact of the matter is, historically, there has, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, been an arc of history that bent toward progress. That arc has now been bent increasingly back. We have ridiculously low voter turnout in this country. We have ridiculously high levels of disengagement in this country. And the fact of the matter is, we have the most ridiculously narrow politics you can possibly imagine. We literally think that a choice between a Democratic Party that wants a free trade agreement, the TPP, and a Republican Party that wants a free trade agreement, the TPP, that's a meaningful debate because the Democrats will say, well, we'd like to be a little bit nicer than the Republicans. We actually, you imagine, this is how bad it is. George H.W. Bush got elected President of the United States in 1988 by saying that he would be kinder and gentler than the guy before him. That's the range of our debate in politics. It's sort of like, it can be really rotten or kinder and gentler really rotten. And the problem that we've got in this country is we got a bunch of people in the back row there from the Postal Service. People trying to save the post office from privatization, which is probably the most honorable thing that anybody could do, because the post office is a fabulous institution, and it's absolutely vital to everything we do. We should not talk about saving Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. What?
It should be a bank.
No, it should be everything. We don't want the whole, bank is good, I'm with you. But the fact of the matter is, it should just be. The post office is great, and yet it's under assault. And here's the interesting thing. The post office has been crumbling and under assault when Republicans have been in charge, and it's been crumbling and under assault when Democrats have been in charge. That's not democracy. That's not a functional electoral process. That is a narrow, controlled debate where somebody may be a little bit better than somebody else, but the end result is always lousy. Bruce Cockburn, the great Canadian singer, he said, okay, that's it. Bruce Cockburn, the great Canadian, I like it.
Democracy.
You're very excitable. All right. Bruce Cockburn, the great Canadian singer, always said, the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. We have a trouble with normal that always gets worse political process in America. We're flooding it with money. We've got a media that has stood down and doesn't do the job. 22,000 newspaper employees have lost their jobs since 2009 in this country. 20,000 on-air radio personalities who've lost their jobs since the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Television stations that shave off their newscasts to fit in more ads. The fact of the matter is that we've got a lousy media and we've got a money-slathered political process. What that is the perfect propaganda moment. And we propagandized ourselves into the narrowest of all prospects. So what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Well, here's the interesting thing. Those founders that weren't perfect, they knew they weren't perfect. And so they put that ability to amend the Constitution in there for a reason. Now, I know that we are taught that the Constitution was handed down on stone tablets to Michelle Bachmann. But the truth of the matter is the Constitution was meant to be amended. It was meant to be amended again and again and again. The founders amended it in the first 4 years of the Republic 10 times. because the people said before they wanted to join that republic, they would like to have the right to assemble and petition for the redress of grievances. And amazingly enough, they said they'd also like to have privacy. We forgot that. But the truth is that we made demands and we amended our Constitution. We amended it again within the first 15 years of the American experiment because the vice president shot the Secretary of the Treasury. And we thought, well, we need a better way to pick a vice president. We have amended the Constitution again and again and again to solve the problems of this country. And brothers and sisters, this is the simplest of all equations. There is no way to look at what we've been talking about tonight and deny the fact that we need to amend the Constitution of the United States to say that corporations are not people, money is not speech, and we have a right to organize elections in which the vote matters more than the dollar. And while we're at it, brothers and sisters, why? You know, if the Supreme Court says that it should be easier for money to come into our politics than for votes to come into our politics, let's tell Antonin Scalia he's wrong, and let's do a constitutional amendment that says every American has a right to vote and a right to have that vote counted. And hell, if we're going to make it matter, let's get rid of the Electoral College so the person who wins the election becomes the President of the United States. Yes! Now, I know, you guys are saying this is the funnest night I've had in the gray room at Powell's in several weeks. It is wonderful to come out in the liberal town of Portland, Oregon, and sit with other liberal people, not unlike myself, maybe even a conservative snuck in, but an enlightened sort of libertarian conservative, and to applaud and cheer with them. But I fear that as I walk down those many steps, grab my cappuccino, and head out into the cold night of Portland, doubts might creep into my head. I might think that Mr. Nichols seems like a very nice man, but a little delusional. You know, that I might actually start to think it might be hard to amend the Constitution of the United States. It might just not happen as easily as we presume. And of course, there's something to that. It's not entirely easy, but it's easy enough to bar the sale of alcohol and then bring it back. You know, the fact of the matter is that constitutional amendments were made a little bit difficult, but not impossible. And we've done it again and again and again. And if you want to know why we talk about it now and how to put it in context, I would ask you to look back 100 years. 100 years ago. If you lived anywhere in America and you saw a little girl running down the front steps from her house, a 6, 7, 8-year-old girl, she would not be going to school. She would be going to work. Because 100 years ago in this country, in that Gilded Age era, children did not get educated, they worked. Little children in much of this country worked. And they worked because the people who owned the factories ran the government of the country. And they got to set the rules. It was a plutocracy, not a democracy. And the thing about those little girls that went to work, we make it cute now. You can go in the children's section, you'll find a book about bobbin girls. And you think, well, bobbin girl, that sounds kind of cute, scrappy. They even make an American Girl doll now, right? You know, like the American Girl, working girl. But here's the problem of it. The reason you had bobbin girls in a factory is because little girls' fingers were small. They could reach into the machine and take things off and move things around that big people fingers, big adult fingers couldn't do. And it's cute right up to the point where the machine gets started and it takes the finger off the little girl or the hand off the little girl. But back 100 years ago, that was okay. We did not punish those who allowed children to be harmed in the factory because in that Gilded Age, those who owned the factory set the rules. And if that little girl grew up, if she came of age, she might go to work in a clothing factory, maybe making shirts or making pants. And in a lot of our big cities, the clothing factories were on the 10th or the 11th floor of a tall building. And in that factory, you'd be there working with other young girls and other women who had come to do their job. You'd be working with Jews and Christians and Muslims, people from Lebanon and Italy and Germany and Scandinavia, African Americans who had come north to get away from the Jim Crow segregation. All these young women working in this room. And when the fire started, when it started to burn, all those young women were strong, and they ran to the doors because they would run down those 10, 11, 12 floors. They wanted to live, but they found the doors locked. Because in that Gilded Age, the owners would lock the doors of the factories so that young women who were working 10, 12, 11 hours, they wouldn't steal a bathroom break. And so the young women up on that 10th or 11th floor, they had to decide whether they would burn alive or jump to their death. And when the families of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire victims came to gather the bodies of their mothers and their sisters and their aunts and their daughters, they found them strewn across the streets of New York City. This is not a story from Bangladesh. This is America 100 years ago. And the people who gathered those bodies up, when they went to that funeral, hundreds of thousands of people came to those funerals. And they didn't talk about what they had lost. They talked about why they had lost their brother, their sisters, and their mothers, and their aunts, and their daughters. And what they recognized was that those women who had died could not vote. And if they had had the right to vote, they couldn't elect a United States Senate. They couldn't control the Congress because the Senate was appointed, not elected, chosen in backroom deals. And if they could control the Congress of the United States, they couldn't control the corporations because the United States didn't have a structural taxing power, didn't have a structural regulatory power. And so they looked at their circumstance and they realized they were powerless to assure that the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire would never happen again, that they would never have to bury their mothers and their daughters again. And they decided at that moment that they would change everything about America. And in a 10-year period, a progressive reform movement swept across this country, not just coming out of the Triangle Shirtwaist moment, but out of all the moments of that Gilded Age. They demanded and they succeeded in amending the Constitution of the United States to give women the right to vote, to create an elected U.S. Senate, to create a tax system and a regulatory structure, all with constitutional amendments that ultimately gave us the rough outlines of what would become a New Deal, that started to pass child labor laws, protections in the workplace, that started to see the development of labor unions. We had, in a 10-year period, a radical transformation of this country. And we did it because we had realized we had just gone too far. We had allowed too many horrible things to happen, and we had not responded. That's how America works. We're like the 10-year-old who says, I can finish my homework on Sunday night. The fact of the matter is, we put things off until it becomes so dramatically necessary that we must act. And so we don't come here tonight to tell you all the stories that Bob told you before, and we don't come here tonight to tell you about all these things that, the history that's all in the book. We come here tonight to ask you a simple question. Are you the equal of your mothers and your grandmothers and your great-grandmothers? Are you the equal of those immigrants, those poor folks, those working folks who work 12, 14, 16-hour days and gathered sometimes at midnight, speaking in multiple languages to say, we will make this American experiment into something more than a promise. We'll make it a reality. That's what we come to ask you. Because the truth of the matter is, we have it within ourselves to reform and renew this country. The power is there, but we have to seize it. And I know it seems overwhelming, but there's good news. We don't have to begin here in this room in Portland, Oregon. 16 American states have already formally asked the Congress of the United States to do a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. 16 American states have already acted, and the most recent state to act up there like a North Star in the northwest corner of the country in July of this year was the great state of Oregon. This state has made the demand. And other states, Washington's going to have a referendum next year to catch up with Oregon. And the fact of the matter is 500 communities across this country have already made the demand. And it's no longer just some liberal Democratic thing. When the state of Maine voted last spring, 30 Republicans joined the Democrats in voting to demand that Congress amend the Constitution to get this money out of our politics and to say that corporations are not human beings. Recently in the U.S. Congress, Walter Jones, a conservative Republican from the Carolinas, walked across the aisle and took the hand of John Garamendi, a liberal Democrat from California, and said, I will co-sponsor your resolution to amend the Constitution because I'm an honest conservative. I believe we can win the debates. I don't want us to buy our politics anymore. I want democracy in this country. Brothers and sisters, if a conservative Republican from the Carolinas can recognize it's time to get up off your feet and walk across that aisle and demand democracy, not dollarocracy, then the people of Portland, Oregon can do it as well. Brothers and sisters, it's time to stop accepting less than democracy. It's time to demand that this country will realize its full promise. It's time to say, no more dollarocracy. No more billionaires setting the agenda. No more Gilded Age. We need a right to vote. We need money out of our politics. We need democracy in America. Thank you very much. Solidarity.